Raise your hand if you like being scared. Oh, okay, good. I'm glad one or two people raised their hands, because I know there must be a bunch of people who really like to be scared. Otherwise, you wouldn't have horror movies, and they wouldn't make the kind of money they make. I hate being scared. I'm one of those people who does not like being scared. In fact, I remember when I was a young man, very young, I was at a Cub Scout meeting around the time of Halloween. And the older sister of one of my pack members and her friend had designed a haunted house in the bedroom that each child was quite ceremoniously escorted into. And I absolutely refused to go. Just flat out refused. I hated being scared. To this day, I do not enjoy scary movies. Things of that nature. I just don't enjoy it. I don't value it. I don't think that I get anything of benefit from it. But on the other hand, there is a good side to being scared, right? There are some good things about being scared. For instance, a friend of mine recently suffered a TIA. It's like a transient mini stroke or mini strokes, and it affects your ability to speak, etc., but just momentarily, and then it's transient, so it moves on. But it's a warning shot across your bow that there's something going on that you need to pay attention to. And so it really scared him, and as a result of being scared, he took the appropriate action, and he went to the doctor and got a whole battery of tests, and he's on some different medications and things of that nature. And so, all of us who have been to school know what it's like to be afraid of failing an exam, and that fear motivates us to study a little bit at least. And so this whole idea of fear and the impact that fear can have on us is really at the heart of what our passage this morning is going to have us look at. The next three stories in the Gospel of Mark, his good news about Messiah Jesus, share this common theme of fear, both good fear and bad fear. And it's important to remember that as we read through the Gospel, we're still only in chapter 4 and beginning chapter 5, we're still at this stage where his ministry is relatively new, that he has just begun now spending intense and in-depth time with his 12 disciples, as well as teaching the multitudes that followed him around. And he had to teach them things about the nature of God's kingdom and what it means to love one another and forgive one another and things like that. But the most important thing that Yeshua had to teach the disciples was what? He had to teach the disciples about himself. He had to reveal himself to them in a way that would impact their lives and their capacity to do the things that he was going to call them to do. And so our passage this morning, he's going to do things that are designed specifically to help his disciples and others around him get to see him for who he truly is, in order that they may begin to live their lives as he is going to call them to live them. And so we have to remember these are 12 ordinary men, fishermen, tax collectors, a political zealot. These are just ordinary guys. These are not the cream of the crop in terms of religious training and things of that nature. These were not necessarily men who were great leaders in their community, men of renown, yet these are going to be 12 men that he was going to send out, and they were literally going to impact the world and change the course of history according to God's will. And so, how is it that men like this come into existence? And I think that in part we're going to learn what it was that formed them into the men that they began to become and to be after Messiah's resurrection. And so what I want us to be thinking about this morning is what's the secret to a life of radical trust and confidence in Messiah, a life of radical trust in Messiah and confidence, so that we would be willing to do the things that he's called us to do. And so this morning, as we look at our text, I want the answer to that question to simply be this: be very afraid. Be very afraid. Be very afraid. And you'll understand what I mean by that as we go through our text. And so the first thing that we're going to look at is this last story that we find at the end of chapter 4, beginning with verse 35, the story of Yeshua, of Jesus, stilling a storm on the Kinneret, on the Sea of Galilee, as we would know it. And so the first thing that I want us to see as we look at this chunk of text is that I want us to see that we want to be very afraid because the right kind of fear is necessary for faith. The right kind of fear is necessary for faith. And I believe that's exactly the lesson that Yeshua wanted his disciples to take away from their experience with him out on the lake. And so the first thing I want us to look at is how Yeshua scares his disciples. He just scared them, flat out, I believe, on purpose. And so we look at the text, and in verses 35 and following, we see that Yeshua leads the disciples into a life-threatening, scary situation. And so look with me, verse 35, it says, on that day, and so you have to go all the way back to chapter 4, verse 1 to find out what that day is, and it's the day in which he was teaching. It says he began to teach again by the sea. So he's probably in Capernaum, a large crowd gathers. He tells the parables, etc., about parables, and then the parables about the kingdom. And now he says to his disciples, okay, I'm done teaching here in Capernaum, which is at the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And he says, let's go across to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And he says, when evening came, he said, let's go over to the other side. And so he's saying, let's go at night, guys. Won't that be fun? Now, they were used to fishing at night. I don't want to make that out as something unusual, but they were used to being out on the lake at night. That was the typical time that they would fish. And so they were used to being able to navigate on the lake at night by the stars, if the sky was clear, or by lights of the villages and towns around the lake and things of that nature. And so it goes on and it says, leaving the crowd, they took him along with them in the boat just as he was. And there were other boats with him. And so you get the impression that, remember, where had he been teaching? He had been teaching from a boat. And so he's sitting in the boat and he says to them, hey, let's go across to the other side. Now, my guess is that they had not brought provisions for a jaunt across the lake, and yet they went anyway. And he says, let's go across the other side. They took him just as he was. And then in verse 37, it says, there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. And so this is a boat, it's probably 30 feet in length. It's not a small boat. It's large enough for Yeshua and all of his disciples to be in together. And this boat is so buffeted by the wind and the waves that it is beginning to fill, and that means either they didn't have the equipment they needed to bail the boat, or that it was filling so rapidly that they could not keep up with it. My guess is that is what was happening, because the text makes it clear that these were gale force, hurricane type winds that arose quickly on the lake, which typically happens there. And the disciples are completely and totally freaked out about it, right? And so they suffer what I'm going to call naked fear. Naked fear is just flat out fearful. There's no awe involved in it. It's just a scared. And so they've got this kind of naked fear, and it says in verse 38, so while the boat is filling, it says Jesus himself was in the stern asleep on the cushion. And so there was a cushion at the back of the boat that the helmsman would use to sit on while he's helping steer the boat as everybody else is helping control the boat. And so Jesus, apparently, because he's so exhausted from all the crowds that have been pressing around him and the teaching that he had done all day and having to speak to several thousand people while sitting on a boat, etc., is exhausted, and he just flat out falls asleep. And what's really ironic about this is the only place in the Gospels where it is mentioned that Jesus sleeps. And it's in the middle of gale force winds on the Sea of the Galilee. So you tell me he didn't set them up. He absolutely set them up. Nothing happens by accident, especially when you're walking around with Jesus the Messiah. And so he's asleep. He's asleep in the back of the boat. And then the disciples respond in the same way that you or I would respond. You got to love this, the nakedness of their expression here. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care? You're obviously asleep. You obviously don't give a flying fig about what's going on here in this boat. You're totally out of tune and out of touch with our needs and our safety." I don't blame them. You ever feel that way? You got something going on in your life that kind of has you shaking the Lord in prayer? Going, "Hey, you can wake up anytime now. Don't you care about what's going on? I've been praying to you about this for hours, weeks, months, years." So Yeshua has them in this terrible situation where he has absolutely scared them. And they experience this kind of naked fear, this fear that does not produce anything good. Then in verses 39 to 41, they experience a different kind of fear. They experience reverential fear. And so in verse 39, look what it says here. It says, after they say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" And Mark reports, and he says, and Yeshua got up, and he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. Right? Amazing picture, right? They're in the middle of this maelstrom, this incredible hurricane force wind that has, at least some of the men on this boat are professional sailors. And they are terrified. They are fearing for their lives. And they wake Yeshua up, and he says, "Hush, be still." He says it rebukes. He rebukes and he says. So what are those two things? Those are verbal commands. And he doesn't say, "I adjure you, Lord of heaven and earth, to bring calm to these seas." He doesn't pronounce any kind of mystical incantation over the seas. He simply speaks a word of rebuke or correction, and he commands them, and he says, "Hush, quiet down, be still." And it happens. And it happens. Then it goes on and it says, and he says to them in verse 40, "Why are you afraid?" And the word they're afraid, I wish the NASB had translated it differently. You could translate it cowardly. It seems maybe a little bit harsh, but it isn't the same Greek word for fear that we're going to encounter in other places in the text, like in the next verse. It's a different word, but it can mean cowardice, and it's used in places like Revelation 21, verse 8, where it talks about unbelievers, the cowards, and the unbelievers will be outside. It's used in the Greek Old Testament scriptures, in the Septuagint, in Judges, and another place where it speaks about those whose fear is going to hold them back from serving in the military. It's used in Deuteronomy and Judges the same way. And so he says to them, "Why are you afraid or cowardly? Do you still have no faith? Do you still not trust me? Do you still not have a sense of dependence and reliance upon me, even in the midst of this amazing storm in which we find ourselves? And so Yeshua has put them in this position, and he has said to the storm, he's rebuked it, and he said, "Hush, be still." Now, what do you suppose he was trying to teach his disciples? And that goes back to why I began our service, preceded the chanting of the Shema and the Via Hafta, with reading from Psalm 107. Now I'm going to go back and read some of the verses that I read earlier. He says, "Those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters, they have seen the works of the Lord." Capital O, capital R, capital D. Adonai. Adonai. Yud-He, Vav-He. They have seen the works of Adonai and his wonders in the deep. For he spoke and raised up a stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They rose up to the heavens. They went down to the depths. Their soul melted away in their misery. You could see their very life force is melting away in fear and dread as their imminent demise looms in front of them. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. You could see the disciples in this relatively small boat being cast back and forth in the waves, or going up and down the troughs of the waves as they tried to keep the bow of the boat pointed in the right direction. They reeled and they staggered like a drunken man and were at their wits' end. That's exactly where the disciples were at. Then they cried to Adonai in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distresses. He caused the storm to be still, so that the waves of the sea were hushed. Hushed. Hush, be still. And so what's the point of the story? What is the calming of the storm teach us about the secret of a life of radical faith and reliance on Messiah? It teaches us that the right kind of fear, we're to be afraid because reverential fear and awe of who Messiah is as God incarnate, the only Son of God, is a key to understanding who he is and a key to developing faith that will enable us to walk with him and please him and do that which he desires. Yeshua chides them for their cowardice, but he ties it to a lack of faith. Why are you afraid? Why are you acting like cowards? Do you still, even after all that you've seen in what I have already done in my ministry, in your presence, have no faith, no trust, no reliance, no confidence? And now look what it says, verse 41. And they became very much afraid. And so the Greek word for fear here is the one we're familiar with, phobos. You know, we talk about having a phobia. That's where we get the idea from. And so this is a megaphobia in the Greek. It's a really big fear, but it isn't the same kind of life-threatening, naked, no-good fear. It's a reverential fear of awe and respect, because look at what it elicits. They ask this question in verse 41, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" What's the answer to that question? He is Adonai incarnate. He is the one of whom the disciples read and sang when they sang Psalm 107 in worship, whether at the temple or in the local synagogue. He is Adonai, and they were blown away. Their picture of him as their great Messiah, the one who would lead Israel out of bondage to the Romans and into political freedom and bring a reign of peace in the land, was not just a man. He was and is the King of the universe himself, taken on flesh to dwell among us. The lesson is that reverential fear of Yeshua as Creator God is essential to a life of faith. To a life of faith. Yeshua knew that what they understood of him was insufficient to produce in them the faith that they would need to accomplish all that God would call them to. The same thing is true for us today. We want to be afraid. We want to have that same kind of reverential fear that Messiah is much more than a man. He's much more than just a good teacher. You know, you can listen to good teachers. You can turn on the TV or the radio. You can go into the store and buy magazines and books by the millions that are written by some wise and intelligent people, some rather foolish people. But are any of them people in whose lives you will place your life? And when that person says to you, I want you to put your life at risk in order to accomplish my will for you and the world around you, will you obey? Where does the faith come for that kind of radical commitment? Where does the faith come for not just putting your life at risk, but putting your finances at risk? Giving the way God instructs us to live. Serving the way in which God instructs us to serve in ways that actually cost us something. It comes from a reverential fear and awe of the one we serve, of our Messiah. That he is God, he is Adonai, that he is in absolute and ultimate control over every circumstance of our lives. And he is worthy of our trust and our obedience in every one of those circumstances. So what's the secret? What's the secret of a radical life of faith-filled obedience? It is be afraid. Be afraid. Have that reverential awe and fear of the Lord. And how do you develop it? You develop by reading his word and taking to heart these accounts because they're written for our instruction. We wouldn't know Messiah's true nature unless God in his mercy condescended to tell us such things in his word. So read the word. But more than just reading the word, step out in faith. And Messiah says, go like the disciples. They went. They had no idea what they were going to get into. They would not have chosen to get into what they got into. But as a result of acting in obedience, they had the opportunity to grow in life-transforming faith. And so not only do we read of Messiah's glory and grow in reverential fear of who he is by studying the Word, we grow in reverential awe of Messiah by following him and stepping out and walking in obedience. Because then we will really begin to see him for who he is. So what is the secret? The secret is to be afraid. And the first aspect of fear that we were going to look at in this first chunk is this idea of reverential fear. Because reverential fear is necessary for faith and a life of faith and obedience to the Lord. But this next story teaches us a different component of fear. And we need to be very afraid because the wrong kind of fear produces failure. It produces tragic failure. And we see that in this story of the deliverance of this man who was afflicted by literally perhaps thousands of demons. And so just as Yeshua scared his disciples in the first story, in this next story, in chapter 5, verses 1 through 20, Yeshua scares the Gerasenes, this other group of people we'll learn about in just a minute. So look with me, if you will, at chapter 5, verse 1. It says, they came to the other side of the sea into the country of the Gerasenes. This is a map. This is the northern part of the Sea of Galilee. You can see it's surrounded by hills and mountains. It's almost 700 feet below sea level. Over here is Capernaum, and that's where the disciples and Jesus left from. They sailed across to the other side, into this side of the lake. And so what they did was they entered this area here. This area here called the Decapolis, which is a series of 10 Roman cities that were all except one. This one here is on the west side of the Galilee. All the others are on the east side. And so they're going from an area up here in Capernaum that is predominantly Jewish. There's a Jewish-Gentile mix wherever you go because of the Roman occupation. But there's more of a Gentile predominance in the other side of the lake. And so that's where they are now. They're in a whole new area. It says they came to the other side of the sea, the country of the Gerasenes. When they got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met Yeshua. And this man with the unclean spirits had his dwelling among the tombs. And so not only does this man have a spirit that is unclean, a demonic spirit, that's what that means, but that he lives in an unclean place. He lives amongst the dead. So he's in a state of chronic ritual defilement. And so it goes on, it says, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound and shackled and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And so, without getting into a lot of detail here, what I want you to see is that Mark, in these few verses, makes it absolutely clear that no one could help this guy. No one could bring him under control. No one could keep him from screaming. No one could keep him from living in the tomb. One of the other Gospels tells us that he was naked, often naked, living in the tombs. And so this man is completely out of control, and no one could control him, according to verses 3 and 4. Look at verse 5. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. And so not only could no one else control him, he couldn't control himself. He was so out of control that he was hurting himself. People who are in control of their faculties and their senses and their abilities do not hurt themselves. This man was out of control. No one could control him. He could not control himself. And then Yeshua arrives on the scene, verse 6. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up. This is the demoniac. He ran up and bowed down before Yeshua. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" And this is one of the ironies, and I'm not sure what to make of this. But what was the last thing you heard out of the mouths of the disciples? Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? And what do you hear first out of the mouth of a demon? Jesus, the Son of the Most High God. There's the answer to your question. Like I said, I'm not sure what to make of that. But the demons understood who Yeshua was, and the term they use, Son of the Most High God, the Most High God is often used in the context of demonic and false religious worship, and that the God of Israel is seen as the Most High God. That is, the God who is greater than all the other so-called gods. And so the demon may have been reflecting that kind of understanding as he did that. And then he begs him, he says, "I implore you, I beg you, by God, do not torment me." And then Mark explains why he says this. He said this because Yeshua had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And so Yeshua immediately, in seeing what was going on, knew exactly what was wrong, and immediately took action to relieve this man of the unclean spirit that was driving him to the destructive things that marked his life. And so Yeshua steps up to help the man. That's what we see in verses 6 to 13. Look at verses 7 and 8. He says, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do you have?" And then he says, for he had been saying to him, "Come out of me, you unclean spirit." And so Yeshua is not cowed by this demon's attempt to dissuade him. He's not dissuaded by this cry, by this scream, by this authoritative command to not do what he knows Yeshua is going to do. And then in verse 9, he also resists an attempt to intimidate him. Look what it says. And he was asking him, Yeshua was asking him, "What's your name?" And so then the demon-possessed man replied, he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And so that's a response that is intended to intimidate. Legion, a full legion of Roman soldiers was 6,000 men. We have no idea how many demons were actually in this man, but this was an attempt at those demons to intimidate Yeshua, saying, "Don't be asking us our name, my name. We are so many in here, we can't even tell you who we are." And he is not put off by that or intimidated by the number and the force and the strength of these demonic forces. Then in verses 10 to 13, he resists not only their attempts to intimidate him, he resists their attempts to escape him. Look at what it says. And it says, and they began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country or out of the area. And so they're trying to get away. They're trying to get away from being destroyed by him. And what the connection has to do with their destruction and the area in which they are currently dwelling, I'm not sure. None of the commentators could explain that very clearly. But they're trying to evade their future. That's basically what they're trying to do. And so he resists their attempts to escape him, and he does this. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain, and the demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." So he's saying, don't cast us out of this man, and the presumption is, and banish us entirely to the pit of hell until the final judgment, but send us into those pigs instead. And Yeshua grants them permission. That's what it says in verse 13. Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. This picture's got to make you scratch your head. I mean, it's a bizarre picture, isn't it? Right? So we have to remember it's a predominantly what? It's a predominantly Gentile section of Israel at the time because of these 9 Roman cities on that side of the Galilee, etc. And so there was a need for pork because the Roman soldiers and non-Jewish people ate a lot of pork back in those days. And so there was plenty of reason for there to be large herds of swine or pigs around. And so this herd happened to number 2,000 in size. And it simply says, and Mark leaves out all kinds of details. He doesn't tell us exactly where they were, how far it was to the lake, blah, blah, blah. All he says is they ran down a steep embankment and into the lake and drowned. That's all it says. About 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. And the verb that's used, they were drowned in the sea, kind of indicates that it took a while for it to happen. Now, I did a little research, and I Googled, "Can pigs swim?" Right? You know, stupid city slicker, what do I know? You know, you throw a pig in water, it drowns. Nope. Pigs swim. And if they ran into the lake, they were close enough to shore to run out of the lake. But it clearly says that they drown. They drown. And what is this a picture of? This is a picture of the absolutely destructive nature of demonic spirits. This is a picture of what their plan was for the man that Yeshua had just delivered. This is a picture of their power and their destructive nature, but more importantly, what is it a picture of? Yeshua's total and complete mastery over demonic forces. That's the picture. That's what the disciples needed to see. They needed to see the nature of his authority, the authority that he would give to them over demons. And so we see this amazing picture of Yeshua as God's absolute authority, not only over his creation, as we see in the calming of the sea, but over his creatures, both demonic and human as well. And that comes out very clearly as we look at the second half of the story, because verses 14 to 20 tell us about the response to these events. The response to these events. And the Gerasenes respond in two different ways. Verse 14, their herdsmen ran away and reported in the city and in the country. And the people came to see what it was that happened. You can imagine this report. The herdsmen, now my guess is, the text doesn't say this, but we can assume, I think it's a safe assumption, that the herdsmen did not own the swine that drowned. People who have herds of swine, 2,000 in number, usually pay somebody to take care of them. These guys are not only anxious to report the facts of what happened, but explain that it wasn't their fault. And so they go and they tell this outlandish, outrageous story. Remember the guy who lived in the tombs? He was running around and cutting himself, and he broke chains. He had superhuman strength, and nobody could control him, and he kept hurting himself. And well, that guy, and Jesus came, and he cast all the demons, or 1,000,000 of them, and they ran into the pigs, and the pigs ran down the lake, and they're dead. And people, what would you do if you heard that story? Go, wow, cool, dude. No, you'd go, what are you talking about? I'm going to check this out myself. I'm going to check this out myself. I did a little bit more research. And an undressed sow or pig weighing approximately 200 pounds on average, 2,000 of them would be worth, in today's market, $1.6 million. These guys lost $1.6 million in livestock because Jesus healed a human being. They come, the scriptures tell us, they came to see what was going to happen, what had happened. And it says they came to Jesus. Look at verse 15. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, and the very man who had the legion, and they became, what? Frightened. Now, here's the question. Is this naked fear, or is this reverential fear? Is this fear going to produce something good in their lives, or is it going to produce bad fruit in their lives? And the text tells us very clearly that the fear that they were experiencing is naked fear. The kind of fear that our ancestors experienced in the garden when they heard God walking in the cool of the day, and they ran and hid, and God said, "Where are you?" "We were afraid because we heard you walking in the garden." Runs away from God. Naked fear causes us to move away from God instead of towards him. And that's exactly what happened. He said, those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And how did they respond? Look at how the people that received this explanation responded. And I'm assuming many of these or some of these people were the owners of the swine. And they began to, what? Implore him or beg him to leave their region. That's naked fear. They saw the power of God. They saw his power to deliver a man. Look at the description in verse 15. You want to see what Jesus' power can do in a person's life? They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, no longer running in the cemetery and through the mountains, etc., etc. Sitting down, clothed, and in his right mind. The very man who had the legion. And they had naked fear. And they started to beg Jesus to leave them alone. Now, why do you think they did? Why do you think they did that? Why do you think they did that? His presence and his power had cost them more than they could tolerate. And the presence of God in Messiah was more than they were willing to put up with. And they blinded themselves to who he was, and they asked him to leave to their own detriment. That's what naked fear does. But in contrast to that naked fear, we have the man himself. And it says in verse 18, and as Yeshua was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him, same word that was used in the previous verse. The crowds implored him to leave, and he implored him to do what? Let him go with him. Please, let me go with you. Let me be one of your disciples. Let me learn from you. Let me serve you. And Yeshua said to him, it says in the text, and he did not let him, but he said to him, go home to your people and report to them what great things the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And you got to love this. Yeshua says, go tell people what the Lord has done for you, right? The Master, God. And then the text says, and he, the formerly demon-possessed man, went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis, this predominantly Gentile area, what great things, who? Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed and awestruck. What's the secret to living a life of like radical obedience? And let's face it, you know, it's not like there's some new tier of the believing life that calls for radical obedience. The way I read the scriptures, the life to which Yeshua calls each and every one of us requires radical obedience. And it requires faith. And that faith comes to us as we see Yeshua for who he really is. The right kind of faith, reverential faith, produces reverential fear, produces faith. The wrong kind of fear, that naked fear, produces failure because it causes us to run away from God. And so I just want you to stop and think for a minute, where are you at? What's going on? In which direction are you running? Are you standing in reverence and awe and allowing the reality of who he is penetrate the things which you fear and motivate you to take whatever that next step of faith is? Or are you like those who are struggling with naked faith, and where you have yourself, where God has got you, whatever that trial is, you're running in the other direction, afraid, looking everywhere else but to God and to Messiah? Fear of loss will keep us from Yeshua. It almost kept me from Yeshua. When I was in the process of hearing the good news of Messiah, I was afraid that what it would cost me would be too great a price. Is that where God has got you today? Are you struggling with the cost of following Yeshua? If you're Jewish, is it the cost of your family? If you're Gentile, is it the cost of your family? Is it your job? Is it the way you're making a living? Is it the person you're living with? What is it? What is it? Whatever it is, let that exalted picture of Yeshua pierce through all of that and fill you with reverence for who he is. For in seeing him for who he is and seeing your need for what it is, faith will grow. And you will be able to put your trust in him even today. Receive him as your Lord and your Savior. For all of us, fear, right? Be afraid. Be very afraid. but with the right kind of fear of reverence that sees Yeshua for who he really is. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for your word, and we thank you for these amazing pictures of our Messiah. We thank you, Lord Jesus, that you are Lord, that you are God incarnate, and that you humbled yourself to take on the form of a man and dwell among us, that you are the servant of servants, that you came not to be served, but to serve and to give your life a ransom for many. I pray, Lord, that those whose fear might be holding them back from committing themselves to you wholeheartedly, whether it's that initial commitment for salvation or whether it's some other step of faith, Lord, may we see you for who you are, and may that produce faith in us, that we might walk with you in obedience for your glory and for our good. In Yeshua's name, amen.